Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Paul Elam here with A Voice for Men, and today I am speaking with Zander Keig. Zander Keig is a licensed clinical social worker out of the San Diego area. He works primarily with veterans, a lot of homeless veterans. Often this population has other problems accompanying the homelessness, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, other forms of mental illness. And Zander works with them to try to change at least the homeless part of the equation so that perhaps they can move on to tackle other problems in their lives without having to do it from the street. Zander, did I get that right?
Absolutely, Paul. Thank you for very much for inviting me on the show today.
I couldn't be more happy to be speaking to you tonight. There is another aspect of this discussion, and I'm not going to waste time getting to it. I think it's a very important one. It's a very important one for the men's movement, and something that we have honestly, I believe, failed to address in any adequate measure. One of the most critical aspects of the work that I do, the work that comes out of A Voice for Men, is about the struggle over masculine identity. It is about, what constitutes a man? What makes a man? What's a good man? Or should we even be putting an adjective in front of the word man? Are there traits associated with masculinity that are written in stone that all men must have in order to qualify for manhood? Anybody that has read A Voice for Men at length or seen my talks before probably already knows my position that the pursuit of manhood in a socially acceptable sense is kind of a wild goose chase, since we all get to identify ourselves. But Mr. Keig has, I think, a particularly unique take on this subject, given the fact that he was not always a man. Zander Keig started out in life as a female and has made the transition into being a man as an adult. I've had several conversations with him. I found them extremely enlightening, and I think so important that I wanted to bring those things forth. And so while, Zander, I would love to talk more about your work with men, which is, I think, very admirable and very important, I really want to focus in on you and this transition, which to me boggles the mind. I'm going to talk for about 30 more seconds, and then I'm going to shut up and let you take the floor on some things. But I cannot imagine for the life of me the difficulty of anybody going through gender transition. I cannot possibly imagine being one sex one day and then at some point coming out of the other end of a transaction and being another sex. The pressures, the difficulty in navigating that landscape. Hell, it's hard enough to navigate the landscape of manhood if you're born a male. It is almost impossible for me to fathom the difficulty for trans men going through this, trying to find that masculine identity or that place to fit. Let me just give you the floor with that. That's not even a question. I'm just throwing out my emotional reaction to this whole thing and seeing maybe if you can pick up from that and take it from there a little bit, and then I'll interject some other questions.
Sure. Well, you touched on so many really important pieces. I'll try and speak to a couple of them, at least initially. So I identify as a transsexual man, and using the term transsexual can sometimes be a bit controversial in the trans community, but it suits me, so I use it. And I came to that identity and started the medical process to transition from female to male when I was 39 years old. So that means I was, for 39 years, for all intents and purposes, I was living as a female. I was being perceived as a female, and I was socialized in my childhood as a young girl. So it's this added challenge that for the way I talk about it, of there's one thing to come from a community. I was in lesbian community before I transitioned. I was part of what's called the separatist lesbian community, so I was part of the lesbian community that has very negative views about men and is very ideologically oriented towards being against the patriarchy. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do.
So, but what's interesting about that is that I was under the assumption when I started this process at age 39 of taking testosterone and starting to identify as male and live as a man, that I knew exactly what that meant. I was convinced that everything that I thought was true about men, based on what I had been taught within society, from my family, from television, from lesbian community, was accurate. And interestingly enough, I started to identify as trans 8 years before I even started taking testosterone. And the reason for that is because I thought taking testosterone would turn me into an angry, violent man, because I was convinced that men were violent, and it was because they had testosterone in their body. I mean, and so once I spoke with a doctor and who also happened to be lesbian, and who was very clear in her presentation one day about testosterone won't turn you into an angry, aggressive, or violent person, then I knew that I was going to go forward. But I still had the other ideas and notions in my mind about, what men are in the world, how they think, and why they act the way they do. And it's all because of power. It's all power. We want power, right? That's what men, it's all about keeping people, subjugated. And so these are the things that I used to believe about men. And then I brought that into my transition with me. So it was a few years into actually taking testosterone before I started actually, one, look like a man and be perceived as a man and start to feel myself like I was becoming a man. It was about 4 or 5 years after I started testosterone. I didn't just jump feet first into, I'm a man. I was resisting a little bit. I wanted to remain outside of that, what's called a binary system of there's men and there's women. I wanted to be part of that other that people talk about, androgynous, genderqueer, gender variant. There's all kinds of different terms for it. I really tried to situate myself there so that I could keep some sense of control on how people. I didn't want to be treated like I had been treating men all of my adult life prior to that point in time, right? All of a sudden, I started to experience the assumptions that I was violent, or the assumptions that I was a perpetrator in waiting, that I was a danger to people now, right? I hadn't really experienced that before. So, and I still consider it something I experienced, and it's very uncomfortable. But so it's my social interactions with people that have changed significantly, but it's also my own mental process that I've had to really challenge myself and come to terms with, like, this is my life now, and I need to relearn how to interact with men as a man. It's something that I've only started focusing on maybe within the last year or two. I've kept outside of what would be considered like men's community, because I just didn't know how to enter it, how to involve myself in the men's community, how to interact with, non-trans men or cisgender men. There's different words for it.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, Zander, my estimate is that about 90% of born men don't know how to interact with each other either. But that is another story entirely. Let me ask you this, and because as you were speaking, again, what I keep going back to is the difficulty in what you've taken on in life. And it's not to paint you as a saint, but to recognize that this is a tremendously difficult process. Can you tell me, or us, our listeners, a little more about what it was like to have all these preconceived notions about men: violent, perpetrators, aggressive, controlling, domineering, patriarchal, all the normal claptrap that the whole society has raises, and I would imagine even more so in the lesbian feminist community. But what was that like for you to hear all this and to have been indoctrinated in all these notions about men, yet living with an irresistible drive internally to become male?
Well, maybe that's where my story differs a bit from the media publicized idea about what it means to be trans or why we're trans, because I didn't really have that internal drive. I don't identify with the language of born in the wrong body. I don't identify with the idea that I've known since I was a little child. And I think that those kinds of stories are a bit more common to transsexual or transgender women. So those who started their life out assigned as male. And I think that has a lot to do with the way society treats boys and girls very differently. So, for instance, I was a tomboy. I could, run around and rough and tumble and in jeans and T-shirts and tennis shoes. I could play sports. But it's not very often that little boys are given permission to play dress up or have tea party with the stuffed animals and put towels on their head to, pretend like they have long, beautiful hair, right? I wasn't penalized for being a tomboy. A lot of little boys are penalized for being, let's just say, tom girl. I mean, I've heard people use that. I don't think it's very common, though. So because of that, I don't feel like I grew up with a strong resistance to push against. I grew up in the beach area of Southern California where I was just sort of socialized into a 1970s Southern California, I wouldn't say gender neutral by any means. I come from a large, Mexican Catholic family. It wasn't gender neutral, but we had kind of unisex games we played in school called new games. We had unisex clothing from, JCPenney. I wore Garanimals, if you remember those, right? So it was the 1970s, Southern California. I wasn't being forced to wear dresses and have my hair done in any extremely feminine manner. So I wasn't fighting against it. I came out as lesbian in my teens without any problem in my family. So I wasn't really fighting, and I didn't come to this conclusion that I was something other than what people were telling me I was, or that I felt inside. It wasn't until I was much older, 30 years old, that I even realized that there was such a thing as a female-to-male transsexual. And this was even before there was a popularization of gender variance or gender fluidity. And because I'm 49 now, so that was 19 years ago. And it was more like an idea was introduced into my consciousness, and I didn't have any resistance about it. I found it interesting and intriguing and something that I thought might be an answer to some of the struggles that I was having as a very visibly masculine female in society. So when we talk about masculinity, there's also female versions of masculinity. And there's not a lot of general acceptance in society of women who exhibit overtly masculine traits, characteristics, mannerisms, forms of speech. Like I didn't take the usual, like, I'm going to sit here quietly and let everybody else talk because I'm a demure woman. I was never that way. I was very assertive, probably even aggressive, which I'm not aggressive anymore at all, which is kind of funny. I was more aggressive and I was more angry, actually, when I was female than I than I am now.
Do you feel like it's possible that the testosterone had something to do with the lessening of your anger?
I think there's I think there's a confluence of the introduction of the testosterone into my system and the internal sense of feeling like things are better. And so, for instance, my day-to-day life prior to transition, and it's not as if it happened overnight, too. That's part of the thing, too. It's like some people, they go to work on Friday as a man or a woman, and they come back on Monday the opposite. That does happen. That was definitely not my story. I just, over the course of 3, 4, 5 years, slowly my physical appearance changed, but I was still basically dressing the same way, and my hair was basically the same way. So my change was different, and that's more common within the female to male trans world than in the male to female. But there was a sense in which I had an inkling as to what my life was going to be like, but only the positives, right? I didn't think about the negatives because I didn't understand at the time. So I was thinking, I'm going to be able to walk down the street holding hands with my now wife, at the time, girlfriend, and not get, looks of disgust or contempt. Nobody was going to make comments to us. I was going to be able to go into a bathroom without being harassed. Going into the bathroom, the female bathroom, as an extremely masculine woman can be a very uncomfortable and in some cases dangerous activity. I've been assaulted in bathrooms. I, on one occasion, had security come into the bathroom and demand to see my identification, saying that I was in the wrong bathroom. And I don't have to deal with that at all. I can go into the men's bathroom, in and out without a problem. So it was kind of superficial to, in my thinking now, like I just want to be able to walk down the street without getting hassled and go to the bathroom without getting harassed. But those two things, over the course of about 17, 18 years of my life, of experiencing them on a nearly daily basis, it was exhausting. It was wearing me down. I had lost my resilience to that. And so taking the testosterone, it changed that. I can do those things now and not have the same kinds of experiences. Now I just have different experiences that I consider to be equally negative. They just happen in different scenarios now because of being a man.
Yeah, let's talk about that just a little bit. And now I know from our previous discussions that you've had a fairly significant level of involvement in the trans community and the politics around that. You've shared with me that you have spoken on this subject before. And I don't want to, give away the spoiler here because I would like people to hear it from you. You told me about a very common question that you got after speaking on this subject at conventions and conferences as a trans male. Do you recall that question that you brought up before?
Yes.
Can you share that with our listeners?
Yes. So the question I get at probably 8 or 9 out of 10 speaking engagements, and I go into college classrooms, I go into nonprofit organizations, I go to conferences and speak, and the question is, what's it like having male privilege? That's the inevitable question.
That was their burning desire to know after you're talking about this incredible transition in life, was what it was like to have male privilege. What is your answer to that?
My answer has changed over the years, but my feeling about it hasn't changed much. But in the first couple of years, I didn't really understand what people were asking because my day-to-day life outside of the street harassment or the bathroom issues hadn't really changed much. I spent most of my teens, 20s, and 30s primarily interacting in LGBT community outside of like going to the grocery store and the bank, right? So I wasn't really socializing outside of the community. Well, for the first several years of my transition, I didn't socialize outside of the community either. So, and I even worked in the community for some of those years. So I wasn't really experiencing what I experience now. So I would tell people, and I still tell people, that I'm more familiar with the things that I've lost as a result of transitioning. And when they say, usually they're like, what do you mean? And I said, well, I feel like I had some advantages prior to transition that I've lost, that I mourn the loss of those advantages. And I think people are shocked. I think really people don't believe that women have any advantages at all in society, in life. And so when I say things like, well, I feel like I used to be given the sort of the benefit of the doubt. There was like more empathy, more kindness that would be shared with me. So people would get to know me more. So they would learn within, the first couple of times meeting me, things about me that would indicate to them that I had some, unfortunate, experiences in my childhood and these kinds of things, that I've come from a Mexican family. But I don't find that people take the time to get to know me anymore. So let's sit down, have a coffee, and talk about our lives that I used to do prior to transition with women all the time. I don't find that women engage with me in that way anymore at all. I'm married, so I'm not dating, so I'm not having those kinds of conversations. And I don't find that because I haven't made myself very available to men in general for friendship, I haven't had that experience with men. So what ended up happening is, yes, I'm a man, but now I'm perceived of as a white man. So that's a whole new layer of privilege. And able-bodied, right? So like I'm an able-bodied, highly educated white man.
Well, you're at the very top of the rung on the ladder of evil.
Right, and heterosexual now too, to boot, right? But what people don't know about me, because they don't inquire, they just make assumptions, is that one, I'm first generation, right, Mexican American. Two, I spent most of my childhood with significant physical disabilities. I was paralyzed even for a couple of years in my childhood. I was in special education. I was in a not a boarding school, but like a juvenile delinquent school as a young teen. Like I had some troubles. But those things are invisible, right? But they were invisible before, but people got to know me and they learned about those things. So I find that now I have to spend too much of my time trying to correct people's assumptions. I guess I should just stop, because I don't know what good it's doing me. But it bothers me so much at this point because I don't have very many years of experience of it. I guess maybe that's the difference. Maybe I'll tire of it, soon. Of trying to say to people, wait, I'm not really that evil person that you think I am. I'm not the straight, white, able-bodied, highly educated. It's like, well, I do have, master's degrees, so I am highly educated, but, I was a high school dropout. Can I get some credit? I feel like I want to put up a little sign that says, give me some credit.
Well, there was a time when having degrees, right, was a good thing. Yeah. There was a time where having degrees was a good thing in life and not a sign of evil. One of the things you told me in the past that I'm going to bring up, because, and I think you just said it in a very eloquent way, but when we talked before, you brought it down to a nutshell, was that there was a time before the transition that people would ask you how you were. They would ask you about your emotional state at the moment. How are you feeling? How are you doing? And correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall you telling me before, that after the transition, that all but ended.
Yeah, that's that sort of, the offering of empathy and kindness that I referenced. It goes hand in hand with that. it's because people are working off their own assumptions, and have determined that I am this particular kind of person, then that means that they don't need to, find out anything else. They already know. And so I feel this significant disconnection from people that I never felt before. I tell people, my one thing about being a man that's the most prominent in my mind on a regular basis is just how lonely it is. Like, I never really experienced a loneliness prior to the transition that I've experienced now. It's a completely different way of being in the world. I used to be able to make eye contact with women. That's not very encouraged now. I was a kind of person who would walk down the street and smile at everybody. And I mean, the thing is, I still do it. I just don't get the smiles back that I used to get as often. So I feel this great disconnection from people.
We've heard this before from, other people that have gone through the same transition that you have. Frequently, they end up thinking, one, sort of like you're describing, where's my patriarchy card? Nobody issued it to me now that I'm a man. I don't have this power and privilege and what I have is loss. What I have sometimes is painful loneliness, and that is a mark of many men's lives. I can't imagine how difficult it is to be confronted with that, even if it's over a period of 4 or 5 years, because, men that are born men grow up and they figure out by the time they're teens, they better not have any emotional needs, particularly around women, but around other men. And it begins to shut down, and then the pain eventually dissolves, because if you tried to correct that, then the pain is too much. And I wonder if you go through that now as somebody, how do you fill in that missing gap? I mean, because at the very least, as a woman, you did get people's concerns, you got their empathy, you got them taking the time to get to know you and your history, and now that's been taken away. Is that something you still struggle to try to recreate with other people, or are you in the process of giving up on it?
I'm definitely not giving up. What I did was, early on, I got some books, and I don't remember the titles of them, but they were 2 books written by the same man, and they were basically like, don't be that kind of man books about men, right? And I think in one of them, the foreword was actually written by a lesbian separatist. And so I thought, well, wait a minute, these aren't the right kind of books for me to be reading. It's like, I am a man. I'm becoming, an adult male. I don't want to read books that tell me, the worst thing you can be is a man and a straight man. So then I went and I tried to find other resources. And I found them in 2 places. One, I subscribed to a magazine called Men's Journal. It's simple, right? You can just get it in any grocery store that sells magazines. But I was blown away by the depth and the breadth of the articles written by men for men, as a male reading audience, and how there was a lot of emotion in those articles. There is. I read it still every month. And so it got me thinking about, men are sharing more about themselves in particular environments. So then what I did was I went to a couple of weekend retreats or workshops where we were separated off, and I got to spend a lot of time with the men. And in those workshops, of course, they were, quote, getting real, right? So they would talk about their lack of role models, their lack of mentors as boys, their disconnection from their fathers, the disappointment that they have in the kind of, job they have. They feel like they got pushed into, doing something in particular. And I found a lot of comfort in that, but there wasn't any lasting relationships that were developed as a result. So then I went online, and then that's when I found A Voice for Men, and started listening to some of the, watching some of the videos on YouTube, listening to some of the, sometimes I couldn't see the picture, so I was just listening like it was a radio show. And I wrote to, there's a gentleman who's part of the, your men's mental health network, who's also a social worker.
That would be Tom Golden.
Yes, Mr. Golden. So he wrote a letter to the editor of the National Association of Social Work newsletter, talking about how the NASW wasn't supporting the development of a office at the national or federal level to talk about and to prevent violence towards boys and men like there is for girls and women. And I thought, well, now that's really interesting. And I wrote to him, and we had a few email exchanges. And it was, so I've made connections in those ways. I've sought out people who, men who primarily focus their clinical practice working with other men like I do. And that's also been really helpful for me is that, working with veterans, I almost exclusively work with men. And I see what happens now. I'm working with 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-year-old men who have spent a lifetime unable to, heal from whatever trauma it is that they experienced, whether it be combat trauma and or military sexual trauma, which is extremely prevalent among, with men as well as women in the military, childhood abuse, abandonment, neglect, all those things. And I see it now because they end up homeless, they end up alone, they end up addicted to drugs with, depression, anxiety, all these things. So I've seen what happens if these things, get out of control, but there's no soft landing place. And so my hope is that in getting involved with a men's community and finding mentors for me and for some of my brothers who are really needing this peace, this connection to men who are not part of the trans community, who can share with us some of the ways in which, maybe you've made peace with this sense of you have all the power and control, but you can't express anything or feel anything, which is quite a double-edged sword.
It's quite a dichotomy.
Right? I mean, it's a terrible, terrible predicament, and, I've only been in it for a few years. I can't even imagine what it does to someone's, sense of self if it's what you experience from a young age.
Well,
but there's a lot we can learn. Trans men have a lot to learn, I think, and I think there are things that we can teach non-trans men about, some of the things that we were taught and where it comes from and how we can work to support each other.
Yeah, and I think that is something that direly needs to happen on both sides of the fence. And let me just, if you will, pontificate a little bit on this particular subject, because to me it's the core of almost everything that we're talking about. Men who are born men grow up with everybody telling them what to be a man. And it's often conflicting messages. Mostly it's messages that, you come in last every time. Your feelings come in last, your desires come in last, A real man takes care of this, a real man does that, a real man does this for a job or that for a job, or real men take care of women. That's what their purpose is, and almost no conversation about self-exploration and what they want and how they want to identify, or even how they want to define manhood, because I can promise you that my idea of masculinity and manhood now is much different than it was when I was younger. I had a very narrow view of those things. But it would seem to me, if I can, and I don't think I'm stretching it here, is that trans men and born men are in many ways in the very same boat in life, and probably few of them will ever recognize it. Our lives tend to be a struggle for identity as men, and even the men in the men's rights community are very different in that they have begun to reject the socially prescribed, real men go to war, real men are 10 foot tall and bulletproof, real men don't feel, real men don't cry, real men don't want or need anything. Real men, in fact, spend their lives blindly taking care of others and never tending to their own emotional needs. I don't think that it's too much of a stretch to say there might be a correlation between that sort of understanding of manhood and a 4-to-1 suicide rate between men and women. But am I off base to say that might be a very similar struggle in the trans male community of saying, what is a man? What am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to do to fit here, to belong, or to identify? And not having had a roadmap provided at any time of your life. Of course, you're twice as much in the dark. But it would seem to me that neither sides of the fence here have a real good grasp on anything tangible when it comes to masculinity, that it all seems to be this guessing game for all of us. And so I'm saying that to say this, that I think what you're saying is very pertinent, that communication and connection between trans men and born men can provide mentoring for both sides of the fence, in that we're probably really just struggling to be who we are, regardless of what society tells us. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the similarities are very you're very spot on with that. I would add one thing that I think makes for an interesting difference, and this isn't true across the board, but it was true for me and many of my friends, is that we've known what it was like to not have those restrictions on our emotions and our sense of self and our drive to, know more about ourselves, right? I mean, at least in my experience, I was encouraged to, for lack of a better, phrasing, be all I can be. I was, as a lesbian feminist, I was encouraged to take on leadership positions while at the same time articulating, for the advancements of feminine or female issues or needs. So, and being able to do that with great passion and not be ridiculed for that, not be told that I was doing something that was improper or unacceptable. So to then all of a sudden come out on this other end and be like, oh, so now I have to basically tone it down. If I'm asserting myself as a leader, now I'm just a power-hungry jerk who won't give anybody else space. But before, it was like, you go, sister, you speak loud and proud about what's right and true for you, right? So there's this sense in which the personality that I developed as a result of being socialized to believe that I could be everything and all things that I wanted to be as a powerful woman in the world, those exact same traits, when I bring them into my day-to-day life now, there's a very, very different interpretation of them. So it's something that it's like you're talking about how you learned those things at a very young age. I just had to learn them. It's like a crash course in them, and I was doing all those things that we should all be able to do. We're human beings. We have emotions, have experiences. We should be able to express those emotions and describe those experiences without, somebody belittling or berating or humiliating or emasculating us. But, for instance, I could have very easily, prior to transition, I could have talked about, feeling, maybe sad about something, and I would get a lot of support, a lot of hugs, pats on the back, follow-up calls or emails to check in with me. Now, that same exact emotion, if I were to say, I'm feeling kind of sad, my general experience has been that it's like, so what? It doesn't, nobody really seems to care. I mean, of course, except for my family. My family cares, but that's in the privacy of the home. There's not the same camaraderie that I experienced before. The support around having emotions, feeling emotions, expressing emotions, and talking about emotions. But I have the vocabulary, and maybe this is an assumption that I have that's incorrect, right? This comes from my pre-socialization period, where I think maybe what men don't have is a vocabulary for their emotions. I know that's true with the men I work with, but that's probably because, they're high, or they spend a lot of time, bottling it all up. They might not actually have the vocabulary, but I'm putting myself out there to say I could be completely wrong, and I have some leftover thinking that says maybe that's one thing the trans male people who enter into just your standard men's community can share, which is, a vocabulary.
Let me offer something to that effect. What I think the experience of most men is when they go through the process, because the childhood for boys is about first shutting down their feelings in a variety of different ways, from big boys don't cry to I'll give you something to cry about, all the way up to the pressures of peers and adolescence, and then pressures from different places, educators, the military, whatever. And my experience in working exclusively with men is that men tend to just channel their emotions in a different way and put it into action. They may not say, I feel sad, but they may go sit down and pick up a guitar and play for 20 minutes as a way to express themselves, or they may build something, or they may work in tandem with other men. And that is the way, not saying this is the preferred way. I mean, people are who they are. And there's a lot of men, and I'm talking about men that were born men, that are the psychology and the way they are by nature is that they need to be able to say, I'm hurting, and to have people respond with support. There is a lot of men who don't necessarily, and I'm one of them, I don't necessarily need to tell people that I feel hurt. That doesn't mean that I don't have pain. It doesn't mean that I don't have a lot of hurt. I have as much hurt as anybody else. But my tendency, either by my training or by my nature, is that I put those feelings into doing something, into creating. And that tends to be part of the healing process, and it also creates a connection with other men in the process. And so there's a dichotomy there. There are two different ways. There is what's regarded as a more feminine type of approach to feelings, which is to articulate them, to express them verbally, and to receive direct compassion and support for whatever the experience is that the person is going through. Mostly happen to be women in that area, but mostly in men. I think what they tend to do is to walk and act their way through recovery. There is still the mystery of and I don't think it's much of a mystery. Some changes could happen. The 4-to-1 suicide rate bothers me. I just don't know if we can connect it directly to the ability to articulate feelings. But that is a philosophical discussion we could go on for hours about. I think what's important here is that you have, I think your experience having lived both sides of the fence really gives you a plus and a great ability to teach in a lot of ways about the differences in how men and women get reaction from society about their emotions. I thought that was a beautiful picture and tragic picture that you painted. And it is a shame that this is one of the supposed gains of white male privilege coming from a Hispanic trans male who doesn't have white male privilege. But I think that's an artful picture of the dilemma that we're in, and in areas where trans men and other men can connect. One of the things I put on an ear for men, and I'll stand by, and there will be people, I assure you, in the men's rights community that will say, Elam's gone off his rocker. Why is he talking to trans men? That's not a real man, blah, blah, blah. Let me say for the record now, so I can get it out in this interview, that these are the very people that I prefer were not in the movement that I'm in. I would prefer to connect with anybody who identifies as male and is seeking to find a sense of peace and justice in their lives as men. And that is my segue into asking you about your experiences in the trans community, the reactions that you have gotten from speaking what must be shocking news to a lot of people who presuppose that your becoming male meant that you were somehow going to be gifted with a new Cadillac and a trunk full of credit cards, and have power to lord over people. What is the response you're involved in that community? Has there been hostility towards you over this?
Well, I would definitely say that the way that I have, I wouldn't say chosen, I'm just going to say the way that I have naturally fallen into the way that I look and act is based a lot on my stature. I'm 5'9", I'm very broad-shouldered, right? So I a lot of times people think I'm a cop, or, I guess I have that look. I get,
Yes, and people will see it. We're putting a picture of you next to me on the face of this as it comes out. That will be a picture of Zander Keig that you're seeing. And yeah, he looks like a cop.
Yeah, it was surprising to me early on in transition that all of a sudden I just started getting called by strangers, all men, of course, on the street. They'd say, "Hey, boss man." So, I guess that connotes some sort of authority figure. But I'd say that the way that I am in the world as what would be perceived of in trans community in general, I mean, this isn't the view of everyone, of course, but in general, I would be considered a binary trans man. So by that meaning, I don't visibly express any sort of fluidity or variance in my gender expression. It's fairly standard masculine, but it's not a performance. It's not something that I'm thinking about as I'm doing it. It's just, I was a masculine woman, I'm a masculine man. It's just the way it is. But I wouldn't say that that's a very popular way to be in some trans circles.
I think you're being very kind, Zander.
Right, like there's really no such thing, in my opinion, as a transgender community. There's more like a bunch of communities, and we're a very, very complex and dynamic and diverse group of people, and so there are many men like me who are part of the trans community, and then there are many who are part of what would be considered the FTM, or female to male trans sub-community, that retain a lot of the negative ideas about men. And although they are taking testosterone and they are being perceived of as men in general by society when they go to work, when they're walking on the street, these kinds of things, they hold within themselves this notion of, I'm not a man, I'll never be a man. And so they project a more, they try and project a more fluid or variant kind of gender expression. They're more visible. They'll say things like, I don't use the he, him, his pronouns. I use the they, them, theirs, or some other pronouns, right? That's a big thing, especially on college campuses right now. What pronouns do you prefer? And so when I'm in, let's say, FTM community, I'm going to, let's say, a conference, or I'm part of a discussion group in a community, I can talk about things like my life as a man, maybe the fact that I've undergone surgeries that not everybody else has, like what we would call bottom surgery, or would be probably better known in society as like gender confirmation surgery. A lot of people call it sex reassignment surgery. There's all kinds of ways to talk about it.
Right.
But in the FTM community, at least based on research, there's only 2% of our community who undergo the kind of surgery that I went through. So I'm part of a very, very small sub kind of community of this other community. So I can stay nice and safe with people who are just like me, but if I step outside of that and go into the broader community, then I bump up against people who have a lot of the same beliefs and espouse a lot of the same rhetoric that I learned and espoused myself when I was part of lesbian, separatist, feminist community. So it's been quite interesting to be in rooms with what I thought were rooms of men, and then it turns out that not everybody in the room identifies as a man, and therefore they have some notions about what that means, and then they project those onto men like me. So it's been quite interesting. What I've decided to do as a result of some of the experiences I've had is I decided to focus my attention on working to educate about what life is like as a trans man, regardless of how you identify, so that more people can understand that we live our lives in very different ways, and that that's okay. Like, diversity is supposed to be something we value. We're part of an LGBT community. We're already part of something that favors this idea of diversity being a good thing. So why is it within the trans community, why is diversity not a good thing to some people? So what I've done is I focused on editing anthologies that capture the stories of different trans men or FTMs who talk about what their life is like and has been from their perspective. And we don't all agree on things, but we're part of this community. So I wouldn't say I've walked away, but I've decided not to pay much attention to the negativity that is all over the place, all over social media, all over our community events. I just don't take it in like I used to, because it's just no good. It's very toxic, and I don't want to invite that toxicity in. But I'm disappointed regularly in the way that people in the trans community talk about what they would refer to as binary trans men. I wish that the discussion had some more nuance to it, because it just feels like a repeat of what I came from. And that's another reason why it's been really good for me to learn more about the larger community of men that's out in the world, to find out that, one, my experience is actually not unique. I thought it was. I thought trans men had this experience that was extremely unique, and then I find out, just men in general are having the same kind of experience to what we're having. So that's been really helpful, and I've decided to just focus most of my attention on building a community of men who want to live, in a world where we're valued as, equal, contributors and participants to
Sounds,
society.
Don't look now, but you sound like a member of the men's rights community, Zander.
Well, I've already been accused of being an MRA, so.
Oh, well, God forbid. We have to go. The hour is for this went by in a flash, but I'm going to run it over a couple more minutes for a particular reason. You've written a couple of books. And can you give us the titles and just a short description of what each one is about?
Sure. Just to be clear, I didn't write them, I edited them.
Okay.
So although I did contribute to one book, I didn't contribute to the other. And I'm working on a third book right now. So my first book came out in 2011. It's called Letters for My Brothers, Transitional Wisdom in Retrospect. And it's a compilation, it's an anthology of 15 stories from people in the FTM, female to male trans community. And basically what I ask the authors to do is think about what your transition experience has been like, and then write a letter to your pre-transition self, sharing some of the wisdom that you've gleaned from your transition, and maybe some of the, rocky road points that you've hit or surprises that you've encountered, as a means to create like a paperback mentor. So people can pick up that book and find that there's no one way to transition, there's no one way to be a man, that there, in that book, are 15 different ways that people did their transition. The second book that I edited is called Manning Up, Transsexual Men on Finding Brotherhood, Family, and Themselves. And this book is also an anthology of 27 different stories of men, trans men, talking about becoming fathers and becoming husbands, learning about their ways in the world as a man, either in the home, at work, out in the community. So some really, really beautiful stories in that book. Both books contain stories from men of varying experiences and different generations, from the 20s all the way up to the 60s, different races, different religions. There's some really great, in both my books I have pieces from men who are part of the clergy in different Protestant religions. I'm a seminary graduate myself, so I have a particular interest in capturing those experiences. And then my third book, which is in the editing stages right now, is called Manifest, Transitional Wisdom on Male Privilege. And of course, I've already talked about that topic, but that's what led me to want to do that book is I thought, I can't be the only person in the FTM community who's having this experience of being sort of blasted with, well, your life, you got all this male privilege now. And of course I was right, because I got all these submissions from men all over the world. We have a piece from Canada, one from Italy, one from Australia, the rest from the United States. And in some cases, the stories are quite apologetic. They truly believe that they're just sitting in this saturation of male privilege, and they need to do everything in their power to correct that. to one person who's absolutely hostile about the idea of male privilege, and then everything in between. So I think it's going to be quite controversial, and I really look forward to the discussion that happens as a result of that being published probably soon after the new year.
I look forward to it as well. Zander, I am also assuming that the first two books that are already out are available on Amazon?
Yes, both are available in paperback and Kindle version through Amazon.
If you would do me the kindness, sir, if you would email me the Amazon Kindle links for those folks, they will be in the low bar to this on YouTube. So if you would like to check out those books, I already have the paperback versions of them, but of course I haven't had time to read them yet. I'm going to have to find time to make that happen. Ladies and gentlemen, Zander Keig, LCSW, a man who helps. And if you don't mind, I will just call you he and leave it at that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Good enough. We have a deal then. Zander Keig, folks, please check out, support his work, not just his work with the books, but also understand that this is somebody who is helping our damaged veterans, which we sadly do not do enough for. I think, in my opinion, he's one of the good guys. Zander, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for doing this interview.
You're welcome, Paul. Thank you so much. And I really look forward to ongoing conversations and friendships with you and other men. So thank you so much.
You can be assured that will happen. And with that, folks, I will see you again this Thursday on AVFM News and Activism, where I will be interviewing the one and only horrible patriarch Nick Redding of Men's Rights Edmonton. That should be a fun talk. But with that, I'll say goodnight to everybody and hope you've enjoyed this talk with Zander Keig. Zander Keig. Zander Keig.